Let's see if my voice is loud enough. Is it loud enough? Yes. Okay. I'm going to move over here because I was told this is where the camera is. Again, I really want to tell everybody. More this way. Okay. And now I'm right on top of you. I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you so much for such a warm welcome. It's been wonderful to be here this whole week, and Chinny and Lorraine made things so easy for me, setting up Grab for me. I'm like, what is Grab? How do I do this? And things like that. So it's been really, really wonderful. I'm so impressed. I've had a wonderful time here and a wonderful greeting. So I am here to kind of offer kind of one slice of a snapshot of a big picture. Okay, I am, as Chinny was saying, from the University at Albany. We're one of 3 Research One universities from the State University of New York system. So it's one of the largest in the country, alongside California's UCLA, and you probably have heard of theirs. Our SUNY system has a few different research institutions, and I'm a research professor. So that means a portion of my time is allotted to research. As a little bit of backstory, and as Chinny was saying, when I was a postdoc, I was invited onto this project that was quite unique. The project started actually as a national project at the University of Texas at Austin back in the early 2000s. And the idea was a simple one. It was, what if we took a look carefully with researchers at the helm at schools where we see unusually better performance among our students, okay? Performance being defined in different ways. It could be how they're assessing on different kinds of exams, how they're performing in terms of our metrics used for graduation, okay? So graduation rates and things like that. So it started in Texas. We were invited at the University at Albany around 2005 to start doing what we call positive outlier studies. Okay, so designing our studies to investigate schools that had trends, at least 3 years of data that indicate that they're getting a better outcome among students. And it could be at any level, primary through secondary level. The other component of the organization that I work in at NYKids is that we had a dean of our School of Education who was quite savvy at pulling together an advisory board of the major organizations that represent superintendents, principals, and we have things called BOCES, which are sort of like I think your clusters are. So we have superintendents at the level of BOCES that are regionally organized around our state. So the advisory board for NYKids was designed to ensure that the stakeholder groups, including school boards associations, which include parents and community members, principals, superintendents, teachers union, the social workers and counselors who work as support staff in schools. We also have Aetna, CVS Health, which is one of our major health companies in New York State, because the connection between mental and physical health and educational outcomes are clearly indicated in the research. So we have this advisory board that informs us. So these 2 components of what we have been doing at NYKids are kind of unique to our state. Many of the people I talk to around the US are a little bit jealous because they don't have a funding line in their budget for just this kind of thing. An organization situated in a research university and designed to be stakeholder informed as we design research that is then meant to be disseminated and taken up in use in our schools. So I don't want to overstate that we do work with every school in New York State. New York State is a very large state. We have 8 million people just in New York City, and New York City is only one of several major cities across our state. Between those cities, we have very sparsely populated rural communities. So when we do our studies, we are very careful not to overrepresent our urban centers, because what's needed in our urban centers might be quite different than what we need in suburban or rural areas in our state. So it's a little different than what you have going on here in Singapore. So as Chinny was saying, I'm the director of NYKids, funded by the state of New York, and our mission is to inform, inspire, and improve in the K-12 space. So what I have here is just a little bit about background on something that is called continuous improvement. I think many of you have probably heard this term before. Continuous improvement is kind of an umbrella term for a number of methodologies or approaches that you can use to improve some kind of outcome. And it's been around for quite a while. Came out of the health and private sector way back in the day when people like General Electric were taking that up in their Six Sigma approaches, and mainly came out of Japan, actually. So what we see in the United States right now is a whole lot of proliferation of some structures to help people take up continuous improvement in the education sector, which has been behind the health sector and the private sector in taking up these approaches. And so what I have on here is that there have been approaches toward this being integrated, continuous improvement being integrated into educational programs at the doctoral level. Okay, understanding that our researchers and our practicing professionals all need to have some knowledge of how continuous improvement is done and why it might be beneficial. CPED right there in the middle is one of the organizations that has been supported by the Carnegie Foundation for the advancement of teaching and developing doctoral level programs to help develop district and school leaders who understand how to use continuous improvement in their schools. On the bottom, you also see that at the level of the federal government in the United States, the American Institutes for Research, they have also embraced the idea of research practice partnerships and have supported not just the idea, but actually funded many RPPs around the country that really rely upon continuous improvement for making shifts in instruction and other things in schools. You also see on the left-hand side, the Transforming Education. There are a series of online micro-credentials offered by the University of Michigan. My colleague and friend, Don Purak, is the head of that. It's very exciting. This is meant to be open access to everyone around the planet who can access the internet. And on the left-hand top corner are just a couple of screenshots of what we've done at the University at Albany to integrate continuous improvement into our master's and doctoral level training. So we have offered different types of micro-credentials, we call them, that are stackable, meaning they can be built into master's programs for teachers, school leaders, district leaders, and doctoral students who are interested in education and human services. So that's a little bit of background. If you haven't heard the term collaborative continuous improvement in education, that's great. That's fine, because the term is relatively new. There are a number of us who have been associated with the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and a number of other kinds of organizations like the American Educational Research Association that have kind of been coming together informally and formally over the last 10 years, decade or so, maybe more like a dozen years or so, really talking about some of these disconnects between research, practice, and policy that you guys have all been discussing here as well, because we have this issue globally. So collaborative continuous improvement is something that we've arrived at as terminology to forward the ideas that you see on here about some approaches to making educational improvements that really rely upon being focused on the end user of the system, which are students, okay? And then backing that up and really considering, okay, what contributes to students' experiences and also families' experiences. That's teachers oftentimes and other school and district administrators. So there are some components here about CCIE that we have kind of built into a definitional term that we are using to promote field building, right? So research around CCIE and what its implementation struggles are, as well as what their advantages of using CCIE approaches might be. This diagram, I don't expect you to read through everything, but this is just to show you that CCIE comes from a long history of different approaches to making improvement. And you probably have seen some of these terms along the way. You may have heard of improvement. How many of you have heard of improvement science? How about implementation science? How about design-based research? Yeah, okay, so you've heard some of these. These are all part of a family of continuous improvement approaches. Each one of them has some differences and nuances to them and what is emphasized and what isn't. But what we're talking about is drawing upon many of these ideas that cross these different methodologies to make improvements. And the idea is to make systemic improvements, not in silos, which is one of the downfalls of educational systems in general. What we're arguing is that we have a need for new paradigms, okay? So that we need to start thinking differently about how we address problems of practice at the level of classrooms and be thinking more about what are the systemic changes around those classrooms that need to be made. How do we develop a more kind of seamless conduit of multi-way communications, as you were just discussing earlier today, between practitioners, researchers, and policymakers. So you can see here it's kind of that to replace that economically driven and fragmented approach to policy interventions, which in the United States has typically meant that the federal government and our state governments provide resources and function as an accountability arm and do not necessarily function as a conduit for that sharing of information across stakeholder groups so that research is practice informed. Right? So that's the idea here, is this paradigm shift in our thinking. A couple of the ways that I personally have been approaching it is relying a lot on improvement science. Improvement science has a number of principles that are related to these ideas in CCIE of being very user focused, being problem focused, also looking for variability of experiences, so beneath averages. So we do a lot of work looking at differences between individuals and individual schools and how they're responding to any kind of implementation of research-based practice. We also relied upon research practice partnerships as a formation, as a structure, way to encourage that kind of community building and that kind of connection between researchers and practitioners that's not just one and done workshop, but rather more embedded, relationship oriented and longer term sustained support. So now I turn to the problems because I don't want to give a rosy picture that this is all easy, because it's actually very, very complicated making this kind of thing happen. What I did recently is partnered up with a colleague of mine from the University of Nebraska, who also heads up an improvement hub at her own university, which is a Research One university. And we discussed leading a double life. That's me with a group of practicing professionals at a school with whom I work. And it's quite challenging to be a Research One professor and be promoted to the highest level of professor when we're balancing the demands, right, of high level research, rigorous research, and the writing and dissemination of that in peer-reviewed journals, and also working hand in hand in keeping the relationships close with those we work with in schools. So it's complicated. And this book that recently came out, Sarah and I wrote a chapter. We called it A Tale of Two University School Improvement Hubs. And anybody who is familiar with this Tale of Two Cities, it is not an easy tale. There's a lot of revolutionary thinking in here that we were trying to actually kind of pick apart. And what we were saying here and what we arrived at with doing some autoethnography about our own journeys is that there are a number of challenges for folks like me who are research oriented, research trained, right? To be able to do the kind of bridging work to our K-12 colleagues. And so I don't have a lot of time, and actually I haven't seen a timer come up, but I don't know how much time we have. Okay, 5 minutes. So just to be brief, a few of the things that we wrote about in our chapter are the need for policymakers and those who work in supervisory roles in our research institutions to be cognizant that we have a number of things in front of us when we become bridging scholars, right? We become people who are actively working to help practicing professionals take up and use our research, and to work in collaboration, importantly, with the design of our research so that it's relevant to their practice. And one of them is positional, okay? So actually working alongside partners and with partners rather than I'm doing research and here receive it is a positional shift that is part of that paradigm shifting that I was talking about. That's also not necessarily easy to do. One of the things that's quite difficult is that power differential that comes into play when you have researchers being seen as the knowers, right? And they're examining, you know, a school or an instructor instead of it being more of an equal footing in terms of our knowledge bases being different but equal in value. And moving on to the next one, this relational one is similar, but it's also talking about the idea of that besides just your positionality, we also have a lot of work to do to make sure that we build trust so that folks who are researched also feel as if they are participants and they also are getting some benefit out of the research rather than just being a conduit for data for us. So this is something that also needs to be understood and negotiated and potentially explicitly discussed to support these kinds of relationships. I'm just going to skip to the next one. There are some structural things that we can do to support bridging scholars, right? And that is to create some infrastructure. Oftentimes the schools in the United States have firewalls, okay, so that we cannot exchange information easily across the university into the schools. So those are sometimes simple, but also difficult things that need to be worked out. How do we share information? How do we use different technologies that the schools may use that the university does not? What kind of protocols and processes do we use to engage with our K-12 colleagues? And then just policies that can help support us working together collaboratively rather than in our silos. And then chronologically anyway, we were talking about just over time. This is again, I think our first speaker spoke to how long it takes from a conceptualization of a relevant research project to its testing and then its eventual implementation and scaling. And this takes an enormous amount of time. And for researchers, it's oftentimes counter to the press to publish and press to publish quickly. The idea of having 2, 3, 4 peer-reviewed journal articles coming up in 1 year when you're trying to sustain relationships over time, that can be a direct conflict. So we need to figure out ways to smooth that out. So just a few minor recommendations just to kind of close down is that we are seeing that in order for that research practice policy divide to be closed, using methodologies that come from that family of collaborative continuous improvement in education need to be embedded into our doctoral training programs. It is not anything to just assume that people who are trained as researchers will know how to engage in sustained, really generative relationships with K-12 educators. We also feel this needs to be worked on in early career. So once somebody is in academia and has an assistant professorship, to be able to be supported and mentored and encouraged to continue to do translational work. So peer-reviewed journal articles, wonderful, but also then what kinds of publications, what kinds of outlets can you use in order to make your research more accessible and usable by others. And then the same thing at the level of mid and later career of being able to encourage mentors. I was a mentor to Sarah. It's wonderful to see Sarah be able to now mentor a next generation of bridging scholars. But we do need, our brand of researcher does need support. So final thought is in my state, in New York State, I'm glad to see some movements in a positive direction in that the state education department is aligning more to this idea that we need to have more multi-way communication so that research is designed to be relevant, is designed at the get-go to be translated into practical change in our schools with the idea that this is urgent, that our children can't afford not to have relevant research integrated into practice as quickly as it possibly can be, noting that it needs to be rigorous for sure. But the state education department has now re-envisioned how they're doing accountability in our state and have actually integrated continuous improvement into the accountability system, which is great to see. You can see that on the left-hand side that they've incorporated a diagram that really captures some of those principles I showed in the initial slide about CCIE. So very stakeholder driven, ensuring that people are talking to parents and others in their community to make sure that what's happening in the school is appropriate and on task. The second thing I have there on the right-hand upper corner, I was really delighted. In the last few years, the University at Albany was designated as a community engaged university by the Carnegie Foundation. And we earned that credential because we now have in our promotion and tenure system alignments to what is considered a pillar of our university, which is community engaged scholarship. So to incentivize researchers by giving them credit for community engagement has been an important thing at my university. It's helped support me be able to do my work in schools. And the last I showed earlier, we've developed micro-credentials to build more knowledge and expertise on the use of CCIE in the university, as well as helping our partners at the state education department and within schools understand how to engage in continuous improvement. And I sit at NYKids in this wonderful position to touch on everything. So it's been an honor to share a little bit about it. I encourage you to take a look at our website. ny-kids.org is where we do a lot of the posting of our research, and you can learn more about it there. And those are just a few references. And hopefully I didn't go too over my time. I'm happy to take any questions.